No chainsaws, no hydraulics, no modern machines. Imagine standing 8 feet above the ground on a narrow wooden plank hammered into the side of a tree wider than your living room. Now imagine cutting that tree down using nothing but an axe, a handsaw, and your own strength. No engine, no chainsaw, no safety harness. Just steel, sweat, and experience. One mistake could send thousands of pounds of wood crashing in the wrong direction. One mistake could trap a saw. One mistake could kill an entire crew. Yet for decades, thousands of American loggers did exactly that. Before chainsaws transformed forestry, men entered some of the largest forests on Earth and brought down trees that towered over 300 feet into the sky. The question is not whether they could do it. The question is how. How did they cut trees bigger than houses without modern equipment? And how did they survive long enough to do it again the next day? This is the story of the men, the tools, and the incredible process that built America's timber industry before chainsaws changed everything. Long before sunrise, a logging camp was already awake. The sound of boots hitting rough wooden floors echoed through crowded bunkhouses. Men climbed from simple bunks, pulled on heavy wool clothing, laced up worn boots, and prepared for another day in the forest. There were no comfortable commutes and no nearby towns. Many camps existed deep inside remote forests, accessible only by rough trails, logging railroads, or waterways. The forest wasn't where they worked. It was where they lived. Breakfast came first. Beans, salt pork, bread, and coffee, strong enough to keep exhausted men moving through another day of brutal labor. Conversation was usually brief because most workers knew what waited outside. Hours of physical effort, danger, and constant pressure to meet production quotas. 12 to 16 hours. A day by first light, crews entered the woods carrying axes, wedges, and crosscut saws. Every tool mattered. A damaged saw could slow production, and a broken handle could ruin an entire day's work. The deeper they traveled into the forest, the quieter the world became. Soon the only sounds were footsteps, birds, and the distant wind moving through giant trees. Then the real challenge appeared. The forests of the Pacific Northwest contained some of the largest trees ever harvested by humans. Douglas fir, coast redwood, Sitka spruce, and western red cedar dominated these ancient forests. Many exceeded 300 feet in height, and some trunks measured more than 12 feet across. To modernize these trees almost seem impossible. Standing beneath one was like standing next to a building. The canopy stretched so high overhead that it often disappeared into fog and mist. Sunlight struggled to reach the forest floor while the air smelled of wet bark, resin, and decay. Everything about these forests felt oversized. Trees bigger than houses. For timber companies, these giants represented enormous value. A single tree could produce vast quantities of lumber. Railroads needed timber, bridges needed timber, warehouses needed timber, growing cities needed timber. America's expansion demanded wood, and these forests supplied it. But before a tree could become lumber, someone had to bring it down. And that process was far more complicated than simply swinging an axe. The most important part of cutting down a giant tree happened before the first cut was ever made. Experienced foremen studied everything: the tree's natural lean, the shape of the crown, wind direction, nearby trees, terrain, and escape routes. Every detail mattered, because once a giant tree started falling, nobody could stop it. Workers cleared brush around the base. They removed obstacles, opened escape paths, and created enough space for the trunk to fall safely. One wrong guess equals disaster. If the crew misjudged the direction of the fall, the tree could become trapped in neighboring trees. It could split, twist unexpectedly, or create dangerous conditions for everyone nearby. That is why experienced fallers spent so much time planning. The cutting itself was only one part of the job. Controlling the fall was the real challenge. Modern loggers usually work from the ground. Early loggers often did not. The base of giant trees was often too wide and irregular for efficient cutting. Large root flares, known as butt swell, could add several extra feet of wood that crews would need to cut through. The solution was ingenious. Workers chopped narrow pockets into the trunk and inserted springboards. These were sturdy wooden planks with metal tips that anchored into the tree. The loggers then climbed onto the boards and stood several feet above the ground while working. Human climbers. Imagine balancing on a narrow plank while facing a tree wider than a car. Then imagine swinging a razor-sharp axe for hours. That was normal. The springboards allowed crews to work above the thickest part of the trunk and significantly reduced the amount of wood they needed to cut through. But now the workers faced another challenge. They had to create the cut that would determine exactly where the giant tree would fall. Standing on their springboards, the sawyers could finally begin the most important cut on the tree. The first cut was called the undercut, sometimes known as the face cut. Its purpose was simple but critical. It told the tree where to fall. Using axes, workers chopped a wedge-shaped notch into the side, facing the intended direction of the fall. Every swing mattered. Too shallow, and the tree might not respond correctly. Too deep, and valuable timber could be wasted. The work required patience and remarkable precision. These men were not simply cutting wood. They were controlling thousands of tons of force before that force even started moving. Precision, teamwork, experience. The undercut was the tree's first instruction, but the final command still had to be given. Now came the moment most people imagine when they think about old-time logging. The giant crosscut saw emerged. Two men stood on opposite sides of the tree. One pulled, then the other, back and forth, hour after hour. Unlike modern chainsaws, the saw itself provided no power. The power came entirely from human muscle. The teeth bit deeper into the trunk with every stroke. Wood chips poured from the cut, sweat-soaked clothing, arms burned from exhaustion. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the giant tree began to separate from the stump. As the cut deepened, workers hammered wedges into the opening. The wedges prevented the saw from becoming trapped and helped encourage the tree to fall in the intended direction. Then came the sounds every logger listened for: small cracks, tiny pops, and subtle movements. These were the first warnings that the tree was beginning to move. Listen carefully, because once those sounds appeared, time was running out. The first crack echoed through the forest, then another. The crown began to move. The giant leaned forward. The sawyers abandoned the cut and ran toward their escape routes. For a few seconds, the entire forest seemed to hold its breath. Then gravity took over. The tree accelerated. Branches snapped. The trunk gathered momentum. When it finally hit the ground, the impact could be felt hundreds of feet away. The sound was deafening. The ground shook. Dust exploded into the air. A living giant that had stood for centuries was suddenly gone. But despite the effort required to bring it down, the work had only begun. A fallen tree was not yet a useful product. It still had to be processed and transported. Workers removed branches, cut the trunk into manageable sections, and prepared the logs for hauling. Before modern machinery, horses and oxen often dragged timber toward rivers, skid roads, or loading areas. But by the late 19th century, a powerful new invention transformed the industry: the steam donkey engine. Introduced in 1881, the steam donkey used cables and steam power to pull enormous logs that would have been nearly impossible to move using animal power alone. Suddenly, loggers could work farther from rivers, reach more timber, and increase productivity dramatically. The forests were changing, and so was logging. Many people assume the tree itself was the greatest danger. Often, it wasn't. Broken branches hanging overhead, known as widowmakers, could fall without warning. Massive logs could roll unexpectedly. Steel cables could snap under tremendous tension. A single mistake could turn an ordinary workday into a tragedy. The isolation made everything worse. Medical help might be hours away, sometimes even farther. Every worker understood the risks, yet every morning they returned to the forest. Because logging wasn't just a job. For many families, it was a way of life. For decades, the crosscut saw remained king. Then everything changed. In 1926, Andreas Steele introduced one of the first commercially successful electric chainsaws. It was enormous, heavy, and required 2 operators. But it represented the future. 3 years later, Steele introduced a gasoline-powered version. Over time, chainsaws became lighter, more powerful, and far more practical. By the mid-20th century, hand-felling methods that had dominated forests for generations began disappearing. The work became faster, productivity increased, and the familiar rhythm of the crosscut saw slowly faded from the woods. The end of an era. An entire way of working was disappearing. Steel sweat determination. Today, it is difficult to imagine bringing down a tree larger than a house using nothing but axes, wedges, springboards, and a handsaw. Yet thousands of loggers did exactly that. They worked in remote forests, faced enormous danger, endured long hours, and accomplished feats that still seem almost unbelievable. The lumber from those forests helped build homes, railroads, bridges, factories, and cities across North America. The forest changed, the tools changed, the industry changed. But the determination required to do that work remains extraordinary. The next time you see a massive timber beam, an old wooden bridge, or a historic building, remember that somewhere in its story are men standing on springboards high above the ground, pulling a crosscut saw through a giant tree one stroke at a time. Without chainsaws, without modern machines, they still got the job done. If you enjoyed this story of forgotten workers, giant forests, and the incredible tools that built the modern world, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And tell us in the comments, could you spend a single day doing the work of a 1900s logger? Because we've got many more stories about the machines, people, and industries that shaped history. And there's a lot more ground to cover.